sold to a 75-year-old sheikh, and the truth changed everything. My fingers trembled as I held the letter that would change my life forever. The time-yellowed paper contrasted with the urgency of the words written in black ink, each letter forming a sentence that felt more like a decree of fate than a proposal. There, in our small kitchen in Chicago, with the smell of stale coffee mixed with the damp mold on the walls, I read for the 10th time the conditions that would lift us out of poverty. Mom was sitting at the table, her calloused hands clasped over her faded apron, watching my every move as if she could decipher my thoughts. David, my 15-year-old brother, was distractedly playing with a piece of stale bread, oblivious to the storm brewing around him. He didn't know yet that our house would be repossessed by the bank next week. He didn't know I was the only hope we had. "Madison," Mom murmured, her voice loaded with a guilt I knew well. "You don't have to do this." But we both knew it was a lie. Every piece of furniture in our house had an invisible tag with the value of the debt. Every meal was calculated down to the last penny. Every night, I would hear Mom crying softly in the next room, thinking we couldn't hear her. The deal was simple in its cruelty. Travel to a distant country in the Middle East, marry a man I had never seen, in exchange for enough money to save our family from complete ruin. The intermediary, a man in an expensive suit with an oily smile, had explained that the sheik in question had a particular fondness for American culture, and was willing to pay generously for a wife who would bring a piece of America into his life. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine what it would be like. A golden palace under a scorching sun, colorful veils dancing in the wind, the scent of exotic spices filling the air. But the image quickly dissolved, replaced by the raw reality. I would be a commodity, traded to save the people I loved most in the world. At 20, my life would become a business transaction. "He's very old," Mom said, as if that could make me change my mind. The intermediary had mentioned that the sheik was 75, more than 3 times my age. A man who could be my grandfather, who had lived a whole lifetime before I was even born. What stories did he carry? What secrets did he hold behind those eyes I had yet to see? David finally looked up, sensing the tension in the air. "Mom, why are you guys talking so quietly?" His innocence was like a stab. In a few years, he would become a man, maybe go to college, build a life of his own. But that would only be possible if I made this sacrifice now. I got up from the table and walked to the small window that looked out onto our narrow street. Kids were playing on the sidewalk, their voices echoing between the old Chicago buildings. A woman was sweeping her front porch, humming a tune I recognized from my childhood. Life went on as usual while mine was about to take a completely different turn. "How long until I leave?" I asked, my voice sounding strangely calm. Mom swallowed hard before answering. 2 weeks. 2 weeks to say goodbye to everything I knew, every familiar corner, every person I loved. 2 weeks to mentally prepare myself to become the wife of a stranger in a strange land. That night, lying in my narrow bed, I stared at the cracked ceiling and tried to imagine my future.
Just to make sure you keep getting our stories, subscribe to the channel, give this one a like too, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from.
What did this man, who was willing to pay so much for an American wife, expect from me? Would he be kind, cruel, indifferent? And how would I manage to live with someone I didn't in a place where they didn't even speak my language? The tears came silently, soaking the pillow Mom had embroidered for me when I was a child. They were tears of fear, of anger, of a deep sadness that seemed to have no end. But deep down, there was also a strange curiosity. What awaited me beyond the horizon? What kind of woman would I become in this new life? The following days passed in a blur. I packed my few clothes in a borrowed suit, wrote letters to friends I might never see again, helped David with his homework one last time. Each ordinary gesture became special with the certainty that it would be the last. Each casual conversation took on the weight of a farewell. Mom tried to be strong during the day, talking about how happy I would be, how this would be a new opportunity, how fate sometimes surprised us with unexpected paths. But I would see her through the cracks in the door in the early hours, kneeling before the small crucifix on the wall, praying with an intensity that broke my heart. On the eve of my departure, I sat with David in our small backyard. The flowers Mom had planted years ago grew wild, but still colored the space with patches of pink and yellow. "Are you going to come back and visit me?" he asked, his words filled with a hope I didn't know if I could fulfill. "Of course I will," I lied, running my hand through his messy hair. "And you're going to study hard. You're going to become the smartest man in Chicago. You're going to take care of Mom while I'm not here." He nodded seriously, as if we were making a solemn pact. That last night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed at the window watching the full moon that lit up our quiet street. Somewhere far away, under that same moon, was the man who would become my husband. Was he also awake, thinking about the young American woman who would arrive soon? Or would I just be another transaction for him, another rich man's whim? Dawn came too early. The train to New York would leave at 10 in the morning, and from there I would take another train to San Diego, then a ship to cross the ocean. A journey that would take me not just to another country, but to a completely new life. Mom made strong coffee, stronger than usual, as if the caffeine could give us the courage to face what was to come. We ate in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. David was still asleep, and we decided not to wake him. It would be easier that way. Without more tears, without more promises, we might not be able to keep. The time came. I picked up my small suit, which contained my entire life up to that point, and walked with Mom to the station. Each step took me away from my childhood, my innocence, the safety of the known. Each step brought me closer to an uncertain future, but one that carried the hope of saving the people I loved most. The goodbye hug was long and silent, as if we knew I wouldn't come back the same person. Mom handed me a small porcelain figurine, a family heirloom that had belonged to my grandmother. "So you never forget home," she whispered in my ear. I put the figurine in the chest pocket of my jacket, along with all the memories I would carry with me. The train arrived, puffing and steaming, like a mechanical dragon ready to swallow me whole. I climbed the steps without looking back, knowing that if I did, I might not have the courage to continue. I found a window seat and, only then, allowed myself to wave to Mom, who had grown small on the platform. As Chicago disappeared outside the window, I opened my hand and found a folded letter that David had hidden in my pocket. In his childish handwriting, full of spelling errors, he had written, "Madi, one day I'm going to be rich and I'm going to come get you. I promise you'll come home. I love you." The tears returned, but this time they were different. They were tears of love, of hope, of a promise I would carry with me wherever fate took. The train continued on its way, taking me far from everything, but also bringing me closer to a mystery I couldn't even imagine existed. The man who was waiting for me held secrets that would completely change my understanding of what it means to love, to forgive, and to find redemption in the most improbable places. But that I would only discover when I arrived at the Golden Palace, where a story of over 50 years was waiting to be revealed. The American landscape paraded past the window like a movie, each green field, each small town, each old bridge becoming a memory I would keep forever. I didn't know yet that this journey would transform me in a way I never imagined possible, that it would teach me lessons about human nature that all the books in the world couldn't. New York approached on the horizon, the first stop of my new life, but it was only the beginning of an adventure that would take me far beyond the limits of geography, into territories of the human heart that I didn't even know existed. Grand Central Station was a blur of movement when I got off the train, my small suitcase looking ridiculously inadequate amid the grandeur of the New York station. People rushed in all directions, speaking in languages I didn't recognize, carrying elegant luggage that made mine seem even more modest. For a moment, I felt completely lost in the crowd, a young girl from the Midwest, swallowed by the metropolis. The intermediary had given me precise instruction: look for a man in a blue suit near the station cafe, who would guide me to the next train. I found him exactly where he was supposed to be, a middle-aged man with a neatly trimmed mustache and the cold look of someone accustomed to dealing with human cargo, like me. We exchanged no more than a few necessary words during the trip to the next platform. The train to San Diego was more luxurious than I expected. My seat was in a first-class compartment, a courtesy of my future husband, I suppose. Through the window, I watched the American landscape gradually transform, the rolling hills giving way to fields of sagebrush and, finally, the infinite blue of the Pacific. It was as if I was traveling not only through space, but through different worlds. During the journey, I tried to imagine what my new life would be like. What I knew about the country I was going to was vaguely romantic. Ornate palaces, colorful bazaars, the scent of spices in the air. But the reality would certainly be different from what my imagination had created. What kind of woman would I need to be to survive in a place so far from home? In San Diego, another intermediary was waiting for me, this one kinder than the last. He spoke English with an accent, but his words were the first truly welcoming I had heard since leaving Chicago. He led me to the port, where an elegant ship awaited. "Madam will be very well treated during the voyage," he assured me, handing me over to a middle-aged lady who would be my chaperone. The crossing lasted 3 days. 3 days during which I stayed on deck whenever possible, watching the endless sea that separated me from home. The water was a more intense blue than I had ever seen, and the dolphins that sometimes appeared next to the ship seemed like messengers from an enchanted world. But behind the beauty, there was a constant sense of irreversibility, as if every mile sailed took me further from the possibility of turning back. My chaperone, Mrs. Henderson, was a discreet woman who had made this same trip several times, escorting other young women in similar situations to mine. She didn't ask personal questions, but her gentle manner reassured me. During meals, she would tell me stories about the country that would become my new home, always emphasizing the positive aspect, the hospitality of the people, the beauty of the architecture, the richness of the culture. On the last night of the voyage, I couldn't sleep. I stayed on deck under a starry sky, brighter than anything I had ever seen in Chicago. The stars seemed different here, arranged in constellations I didn't recognize. It was as if even the sky was reminding me that I was entering a completely new world. When the sun rose on the third day, it was already possible to see the coast approaching. First, just a dark line on the horizon, then more defined contours of mountains and buildings. My heart beat faster and faster as we approached the port. In a matter of hours, I would see the face of the man who had decided my fate. The disembarkation was a chaos of sounds, smells, and colors. Vendors shouted in a language I didn't understand, offering exotic fruits and shiny fabrics. The aroma of spices mixed with the salty smell of the sea, and something else indefinable, the smell of a culture completely different from mine. Mrs. Henderson guided me through the crowd to where an ornate carriage was waiting for. The coachman was an elderly man with a white beard, dressed in colorful traditional clothes. He smiled gently when he saw me, said a few words in broken English that sounded like a welcome, and carefully placed my luggage in the carriage. It was the first truly welcoming face I had seen since leaving home. The trip to the palace took over an hour, during which my eyes didn't stop for a single moment. The landscape was simultaneously arid and exuberant, with towering palm trees contrasting with golden dunes in the distance. We passed through small villages where children chased after goats. Women carried ceramic pots on their heads, and turbaned men talked animatedly in the shade of centenary trees. As we approached the palace, the architecture became more grandiose. High walls decorated with intricate mosaics, wrought iron gates, gardens where fountains sang crystalline melodies. Everything was more opulent than I could have imagined, but also more intimidating. How could a simple girl from the Midwest belong in a place like this? Finally, the main gates opened before us, revealing an inner courtyard that took my breath away. Marble columns rose toward the sky, supporting delicately carved arches. Hanging gardens created an oasis of green amid the gold of the architecture. Fountains gushed crystalline water into ornate pools, where rose petals floated like small, colorful boats. It was then that I saw him for the first time. He was at the top of a marble staircase, an imposing figure dressed in richly embroidered, traditional clothes. Even from a distance, I could perceive his erect posture, the royal dignity in every gesture. As the carriage approached, his features became clearer. A 75-year-old man, as I had been told, but one who maintained a magnetic presence. His eyes met mine across the distance, and something strange happened. For a brief moment, I saw an expression I hadn't expected on his face. Not one of satisfaction at having acquired a new possession, but something deeper and more disturbing. It was as if he was seeing a ghost, as if my presence there had awakened memories he preferred to keep buried. I got out of the carriage on legs that barely supported me, my small suitcase in one hand and Mom's porcelain figurine clutched to my chest with the other. He came down the stairs slowly, each step measured and deliberate. When we were finally face to face, I could see his eyes up close. They were dark, almost black, but laden with a melancholy that seemed ancient. "Mademoiselle Madison," he said in perfect English, his voice deep and cultivated. The accent was there, but almost imperceptible. "Welcome to your new home." His words were courteous, but there was something in his tone that intrigued me. It wasn't the cold formality I had expected, but something more complex, as if each word carried a weight I couldn't yet comprehend. I made an awkward curtsy, not knowing exactly what protocol to follow. He extended his hand, and when our fingers touched briefly, I felt a shudder that wasn't just nervous. There was electricity in that touch, a connection that didn't make sense between two people meeting for the first time. "You must be tired from the journey," he continued, gesturing for servants to approach and take my luggage. "Yasmin will show you to your quarters. We will dine together when you are rested." It was a gentle order, but an order nonetheless. I was officially in his house, under his rules. Yasmin was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a welcoming smile. She didn't speak English, but her gestures were universal in the language of hospitality. She led me through endless seeming corridors, decorated with rich tapestries and lit by crystal chandeliers that cast colorful patterns on the marble walls. My quarters were more luxurious than our entire house in Chicago. The bed was enormous, covered with silks and hand-embroidered pillows. Arched windows opened onto a private garden where roses of all colors grew in abundance. A marble bathtub occupied a corner of the room, already prepared with warm water perfumed with essential oils. Yasmin helped me take off my dusty travel clothes and bathe. The warm water was a relief after the days of tension, but I couldn't completely relax. My mind was buzzing with questions about the man I had just met. Why had he seemed so disturbed to see me? Why did he speak English with such fluency? And, most importantly, what kind of life awaited me? After the bath, Yasmin presented me with clothes that had been prepared for me. Silk dresses in soft tones, delicate jewelry, shoes more elegant than anything I had ever owned. It was as if they were transforming me into someone different, molding me to fit the role expected of me. When I was finally alone, I sat by the window and looked down at the garden. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that were reflected in the rose petals. It was undeniably beautiful, but the beauty couldn't completely mask the reality of my situation. I was there as part of a commercial agreement, a solution to financial problems, not out of choice. I took David's letter from my discarded jacket and reread it one more time. His childish words about rescuing me one day gave me strength. Regardless of what awaited me there, I had a purpose: to ensure my family was safe, that David could have the opportunities I never had, that Mom no longer had to cry secretly in the early hours. A soft knock on the door interrupted my thoughts. It was time for dinner. Time to officially begin my new life as the wife of a man I had just met, in a palace full of secrets I couldn't even imagine existed. I took a deep breath, smoothing the silk dress, and headed for what would be the first of many meals that would shape my destiny. The dining hall was a masterpiece of architecture that left me momentarily speechless. The vaulted ceiling rose to impressive height, decorated with intricate frescoes that told stories I couldn't decipher. Golden chandeliers hung like terrestrial stars, projecting a warm light onto the long table that could easily seat 30 people, but was set for only 2. He was already there when I arrived, standing next to one of the architectural windows that opened onto the night garden. The moonlight filtered through the silk curtain, creating a play of shadows that made his silhouette even more imposing. When he heard me enter, he turned slowly, and once again I saw that strange expression cross his face, as if he was seeing something that deeply disturbed him. "You look beautiful," he said simply, but there was something in his voice that made the compliment more complex than its. It wasn't the superficial admiration of a man observing his new acquisition, but something deeper, almost melancholic. He approached to pull out my chair, a gesture of chivalry I didn't expect from someone who had essentially bought me. The table was set with an elegance that surpassed anything I had ever seen. Fine porcelain plates decorated with gold, crystal glasses that reflected the candlelight like prism, hand-wrought silver cutlery, Each element seemed to have been chosen not just for its functionality, but for the artistic beauty it represented. Servants brought dishes that were true culinary works of art, local specialties that awakened my senses with completely new aromas and flavors, but also some surprises that made me question the coincidence. There was a pot roast prepared exactly as Mom made it, fresh American bread that rivaled the best bakery in Chicago, and wine from a specific region of California that I recognized by the label. "I hope the food is to your liking," he said, watching my reaction with disturbing attention. "I took the liberty of including some familiar flavors to make your transition." His words were considerate, but there was something behind them that intrigued me. How did he know exactly what flavors would be familiar to me? During the meal, he asked questions about my life in Chicago, about my family, about my dreams and aspirations. It was a strangely intimate conversation for two people meeting for the first time. He listened to my answers with an intensity that went beyond social courtesy, as if each word was a piece of a puzzle he was trying to put together. "Did you study American literature?" I asked, trying to understand where his fluency in the language came from. He paused with his fork in the air, a nostalgic smile crossing his mature face. "I studied many things in New York, a long time ago," he replied vaguely. "America has always held a special fascination." New York, the word echoed in my mind. He had been to New York, had lived there long enough to master not only the language, but its cultural subtlety. That would explain his knowledge of American food, his familiarity with our customs. But it also raised new questions. Why had a man of his position chosen to study in America? And why had he returned? As the night progressed, I realized he knew details about America that went beyond academic knowledge. He spoke about the seasons in different regions, about local festivals, about small traditions that only someone who had actually lived there could know. There was an intimacy in his descriptions that suggested personal memory, not just book knowledge. "You're nostalgic," I observed, more of a statement than a question. His eyes met mine across the table, and for a moment, the mask of formal courtesy slipped, revealing something more vulnerable underneath. "There are many things I miss," he admitted, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken meanings. I felt that there were layers of history in his words, secrets kept for decades that might never be fully revealed. But I also felt an unexpected connection beginning to form between us, not the kind of romantic attraction you read about in novels, but something deeper, a mutual understanding of people who carried losses. After dinner, he led me to a terrace that offered a panoramic view of the city lit up below. The lights shone like terrestrial stars, creating a carpet of golden dots that stretched to the horizon. The night breeze carried the scent of jasmine from the gardens, mixed with exotic aromas from the distant city. "Tomorrow, if you wish, I can show you the library," he offered, his hands resting on the marble balustrade. "I have a considerable collection of American literature. Perhaps you'll find some familiar authors." There was something in his tone that suggested this offer was more important than it seemed on the surface. "I would like that very much," I replied sincerely. The prospect of having access to books again was one of the few things that genuinely excited me about my new situation. In Chicago, we barely had money for basic necessities, let alone books. He turned to look at me once more, and in the moonlight, I could see the lines of time etched on his face. They weren't just wrinkles of age, but marks of someone who had lived intensely, who had loved and lost, who carried stories that could fill volumes. "Madison," he said my name, as if he were testing how it sounded in his voice. "I hope that, in time, you can find some happiness." His words carried a sincerity that surprised me. It wasn't the arrogance of a man who had bought what he wanted, but almost a plea, as if my happiness was important to him for reasons that went beyond personal satisfaction. "Thank you," I murmured, not knowing what else to say. When I finally retired to my quarters, my mind was buzzing with conflicting impressions. The man I had met didn't match the image I had created during the journey at all. He wasn't the cruel tyrant or the perverted old man my fear had imagined. Instead, he was someone complex, educated, laden with melancholy and secrets. Lying in the luxurious bed, watching the shadows dance on the ceiling with the silk curtain, I tried to process everything that had happened. In a few hours, my perspective on my situation had begun to change. I was still there against my will, still the result of a financial transaction. But I was beginning to suspect that there was much more to this story than I had initially imagined. I took David's letter again and reread it in the moonlight. His words about rescuing me one day took on a different meaning now. Maybe the rescue wasn't necessarily physical. Maybe it was about finding a way to turn this impossible situation into something that could, somehow, make sense. The garden below was silent except for the gentle murmur of the fountains and the occasional night song of some exotic bird. It was a place of undeniable beauty, but also of isolation. I was thousands of miles from everything I knew, living with a man who was simultaneously kind and mysterious, in a palace that seemed to hold stories in every corridor. I finally fell asleep, but my dreams were populated by fragments of the dinner conversation, by the enigmatic expression that crossed his face whenever he looked at me, by the questions he asked as if my answers were fundamental to some puzzle that only he understood. I didn't know yet that the next day, exploring the library he had mentioned, I would find the first clue to a mystery that would completely change my understanding of why I was really there. The morning came with the melodious song of birds that didn't exist in Chicago, and golden sunbeams that penetrated through the curtains like divine fingers. Yasmin brought breakfast on a silver tray, exotic fruits I had never tasted, fresh bread, honey that tasted of flowers I couldn't identify, and strong aromatic coffee that rivaled anything I had ever had. After breakfast, as promised, he came to get me to see the library. We walked through corridors that looked different in the daylight. The mosaics on the walls revealed more vibrant colors. The architectural windows offered stunning views of gardens that stretched much further than I had realized the night before. With each step, I discovered new architectural details that spoke of centuries of artistic refinement. The library was one of the first additions I made to the palace when I became the Sheikh, he explained as we walked. I have always believed that a house without books is a house without a soul. His words echoed with a conviction that suggested personal experience, as if he himself had lived in soulless places before creating this refuge of knowledge. When the double doors of carved wood opened, I had to suppress a gasp of admiration. The library was vast, with shelves that rose from floor to ceiling, reachable by movable, polished wood ladders. Thousands of volumes lined up in meticulous order, their spines creating a mosaic of colors and textures that was a work of art in itself. But what really caught my attention was the organization. An entire section was dedicated exclusively to American literature, not just the classics that any respectable library would have, but rare edition, first printing, works by obscure authors that would be difficult to find even in the best bookstores in New York. It was a collection that had clearly been built over decades by someone with intimate knowledge and a genuine passion for American literature. How did you manage to gather all this? I asked, running my fingers over the spines of books I recognized and many others that were completely new to me. He approached, removing a specific volume from the shelf with the familiarity of someone who knew the exact location of each book. "This is an original copy of The Great Gatsby," he said, handing me the book with reverential care. I bought it from a rare book dealer in Greenwich Village in 1952. The specific date, the precise location, they weren't vague pieces of information from someone recalling hearing about it, but crystalline memories from someone who had been there. As I carefully leafed through the yellowed pages, he walked to a more distant section of the library. Curious, I followed him and discovered something that left me perplexed. It was almost a shrine dedicated to American culture. Not just books, but objects, photographs, documents, letters. There were delicate porcelains from Chicago, silver cutlery of a clearly American design, even a small painting that showed a familiar view of the Brooklyn Bridge. "Did you collect these things while you were in New York?" I asked, trying to understand the extent of his connection to my home country. He stopped in front of a specific shelf, his fingers tracing the spine of a book without removing it. "Some things were collected during my time there," he admitted. Others, Others were acquired later, as a way of keeping certain memories alive." There was a deep melancholy in his voice that suggested these memories were simultaneously precious and painful. It was then that I noticed something that made me stop abruptly. There was a framed photograph, almost hidden between the books, that showed the Brooklyn Bridge, But it wasn't a common tourist photo. It was an intimate image, taken from an angle that suggested familiarity with the location, as if the photographer knew the best secret viewpoint of New York. "Did you take this photo?" I asked, picking up the frame delicately. He turned, and when he saw what I was holding, an expression of surprise and something akin to alarm crossed his face. "Yes," he admitted after a long pause. "A long time ago." He reached out to take the photograph back, but not before I noticed something else in the image. At the bottom, almost out of frame, there was the shadow of two, the photographer and someone else. Someone who was close enough for their shadows to mingle. "You weren't alone when you took this photo," I observed, handing him the frame. It wasn't exactly a question, but an observation that seemed to carry more weight than it should. He held the photograph with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. "No," he confirmed in a low voice. "I wasn't." He put the photo back in its place, but I saw that his eyes remained on it for a moment longer than necessary, as if he was seeing not just but reliving the memory of the moment it was captured. The silence that followed was heavy with unexpressed meaning. I felt that I had stumbled upon something important, a clue to understanding why I was really there, why a man of his position had specifically chosen a young American woman, why that entire collection of American objects and memories. "Was there someone special in your life when you were in New York?" I asked gently, hoping my curiosity wouldn't be interpreted as an invasion of privacy. He moved away from the shelf, walking to one of the large windows that offered a view of the garden. "There was," he finally admitted, his voice laden with a pain that clearly persisted after decades. "Someone very special." He didn't elaborate, but he didn't have to. The way he said those words, the expression on his face, the very existence of that collection, everything pointed to a story of lost love, to someone who had marked his life indelibly. I continued exploring the library, but now with a different look. Every American object, every carefully preserved book, every photograph, took on a new meaning. They weren't just collector's items, but memorabilia from a time in his life that had clearly been transformative. I found a small volume of poetry, Whitman, with annotations in the margins written in English. The handwriting was his, I recognized by the elegant style. But there were also other annotations in a different, more delicate hand, clearly feminine. They were comments on the poems, silent dialogues between two readers who had shared not only the books, but intimate interpretations of love, loss, hope. "You read these books with someone?" I said, unable to contain my growing curiosity. He approached to see what I was holding, and when he recognized the specific volume, his eyes closed briefly, as if a physical pain had hit him. "Isabel loved Whitman," he murmured, and it was the first time he had said a specific name, Isabel. The woman who had shared his reading afternoons in New York, who had left her own impressions in the margins of the books he still kept as treasures. The name echoed in the silent library like a confession. Isabel. Now I had a name for the ghostly presence that seemed to inhabit every corner of the American collection, every carefully preserved object, every photograph laden with nostalgia. "What happened to her?" I asked softly, closing the book but keeping it in my hands. It was too intimate a question for our second date together, but I felt he needed to talk about it. That carrying this secret for decades had created a weight that only grew with time. He walked to a leather armchair and sat down heavily, gesturing for me to do the same in a nearby chair. For a long moment, we were silent, he clearly struggling with old memories, and me waiting patient, holding the annotated Whitman book as if it were a bridge between his past and our present. "We were young," he finally began, his voice distant as if he were talking about another life. "I was 22, studying engineering at Columbia. She was a few years younger, studying literature. We met in a bookstore in Greenwich Village. She was looking for a specific edition of Kerouac, and I had happened to see the book on another shelf."
Since you've been here with me all this time, it means you enjoy our story. So, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. Give this one a like, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from.
I could visualize this to young people in a New York bookstore, connected by a shared love of literature, by the casual discoveries that sometimes change the course of an entire life. It was romantic in a way that only New York in the 1950s. We started meeting to read together, he continued, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the window. Whole afternoons in cafes, endless discussions about philosophy and poetry, walks along the Hudson at sunset. It was the happiest period of my life, but there was a deep sadness in his voice that indicated this happiness had come to an end. I waited for him to continue, still holding the book annotated by both of them, feeling the weight of the story that was being revealed. Then politics got in the way, he said bitterly. My country was going through changes. My family called me back. There were obligations, dynastic responsibilities that I couldn't ignore. I promised Isabel I would come back, that we would find a way to be together. But you didn't come back, I concluded gently. He shook his head, an expression of old pain crossing his mature face. I tried, God knows, but the circumstances, the political situation deteriorated. Borders were closed, communications were cut off. When I finally managed to return to New York, years later, she had disappeared. No one knew where she was, what had happened to her. The silence that followed was heavy with decades of regret. I began to understand why I was there, why he had specifically chosen a young American woman. It wasn't just an abstract cultural obsession, but an attempt to recover something he had lost, to fill a void that Isabel had left. You think I look like her? I said, finally understanding the strange expression that crossed his face whenever he looked at me. It wasn't desire or satisfaction, but painful recognition. The sight of a ghost he had tried to exorcise over decades, but who still haunted him. More than it should be possible, he admitted, looking up to meet my eyes for the first time since he had started telling his story. When I saw your photograph for the first time, for a moment I thought that... His voice trailed off. The sentence left incomplete, but I understood what he couldn't say. For a moment, he had thought that maybe it was her, that somehow impossibly, Isabel had returned to him through me. It was a desperate fantasy of a man who had carried a loss for over 50 years, who had built a shrine to the memory of a lost love, and was now trying to resurrect it through a stranger who happened to have a familiar face. I spent the rest of that morning in the library, leafing through books Isabel had touched, reading notes she had made decades before I was born. It was a strange and melancholic experience, as if I were talking to a ghost across time. Her observations on literature revealed a sharp mind, sensitive, passionate about words and ideas, in the same way I had always been. In a volume of Emily Dickinson, I found a note that made me stop. Poetry is not just art, it is prophecy. It reveals truths that we cannot yet see clearly. Her handwriting was elegant, confident, that of someone who believed in the transformative power of. Next to it, in his handwriting, there was a response. Then you are a prophetess, my dear, because you see beauty where others see only chaos. It was too intimate, too personal. I closed the book quickly, feeling like an intruder in private conversations that were never meant for strange eyes. But at the same time, there was something fascinating about witnessing the intellectual dialogue who clearly loved each other, not just romantically, but also as companions in thought. Yasmin came to get me for lunch, finding me surrounded by piles of books I had been exploring. She smiled understandingly, gesturing in a way I understood as approval for my passion. During the solitary lunch, he had left to deal with business. I was told I reflected on the revealing morning. Now I understood why I was there, but the understanding brought new dilemmas. I wasn't Isabel. I could never be. I was a completely different person, with my own story, my own dreams and fears. But he was clearly trying to project her onto me, trying to recreate a lost past through a stranger who happened to have familiar features. It was simultaneously tragic and disturbing. Tragic because I could feel the genuine pain of a loss that had shaped decades of his life. Disturbing because it meant that my presence there was not just about me, but about his inability to let the past rest in. In the afternoon, I explored more of the palace, trying to better understand the man I was destined to live with. Yasmin accompanied me, pointing out different rooms and their function. Although our communication was limited by the language barrier, I discovered secret gardens hidden behind high walls, ornate fountains that created aquatic symphony, terraces that offered panoramic views of the arid landscape beyond the palace. It was during this exploration that I discovered something that would completely change my perspective on my situation. In a less ornate corridor, clearly a service area of the palace, I noticed a door that looked different from the others. It was simpler, without elaborate decoration, but there was something about it that aroused my curiosity. Yasmin tried to dissuade me when I approached the door, gesturing nervously and shaking her head, but her reaction only intensified my curiosity. Why would a specific door be forbidden? What was in there that couldn't be seen? I waited until Yasmin was distracted with another matter before returning to the corridor alone. The door was locked, but the lock was old, and years of helping Mom with household repairs in Chicago had taught me some improvised techniques. With a hairpin and patience, I managed to open the lock. What I found inside left me breathless. It was a room completely different from the rest of the palace, simpler, more intimate, but charged with an atmosphere that was simultaneously familiar and strange. The walls were covered with photographs of New York, not the official tourist images I had seen in the library, but personal, intimate photographs, clearly taken by someone who knew and loved the city. There were also objects that clearly didn't belong to the local culture. A woman's jacket hung carefully in an open closet, small shoes perfectly lined up next to the bed, a bottle of perfume from a brand I recognized from expensive department stores in Chicago. But the most disturbing were the photographs scattered on a table, dozens of them, all showing the same woman. I approached the table with my heart beating fast. The photographs were clearly old, from the 1950s and 1960s, but the quality was excellent. They showed a young, beautiful woman with dark hair and expressive eyes. She was in various places in New York, along the Hudson, in Central Park, in charming cafes, always smiling, always radiant. But what made me gasp was when I picked up a specific photograph. It was her looking directly at the camera, laughing at something the photographer had said, with an expression of pure and carefree happiness. Except for her hair, which she wore shorter, and her clothes from the era, I could have been looking at my own photograph. The resemblance was disturbing, impossible, as if we were twins separated by decades. The same facial structure, the same expressive eyes, the same slightly asymmetrical smile that Mom always said was my trademark. It was as if Isabel was a version of me from another era, or I was a reincarnation of her in the present. I picked up more photographs, examining each one with a mixture of fascination and growing horror. In some, she was clearly posing for the photographer, but in others, more intimate. She was simply living, reading a book, drinking coffee, watching the movement of the New York street. All captured a spontaneous joy that contrasted painfully with the fact that she was now just a memory preserved on paper. It was then that I found something that made me question everything I thought I knew about my own situation. Among the photographs, there was a document, an American birth certificate, dated 1932. The name was Isabelle Marie Dubois, born in Chicago. Chicago, my hometown, the same city where I had grown up, where Mom still lived with David. It couldn't be a coincidence. Isabel wasn't just any American woman he had loved in New York. She was from Chicago, just like me. My hands trembled as I looked for more documents. One found an old American passport, letters with Chicago addresses, even a photograph that showed a street I recognized perfectly. It was just 2 blocks from our house. Isabel had grown up practically where I had walked the same street, breathed the same air. The coincidence was impossible. It was beyond any rational explanation. How had he found me, specifically chosen me, if he didn't know exactly where to look? How had he known that a young woman from Chicago, who looked extraordinarily like Isabel, would be available for the kind of deal that had brought us together? A sound of footsteps in the corridor made me react quickly. I put everything back exactly as I had found it and left the room, locking the door behind me. When Yasmin appeared around the corner of the corridor, I tried to look casual, as if I were just innocently exploring the palace. But my mind was buzzing with the implications of what I had discovered. My presence there was not the result of coincidence or fate, but of deliberate He had specifically looked for me, or for someone like me, using criteria that went far beyond simple nationality. During dinner that night, I watched him with different eyes. Every courteous gesture, every question about my past, every nostalgic expression when he looked at me, took on a sinister meaning. He wasn't simply trying to get to know me, he was comparing, checking if I matched the memories he had kept of another person. "Did you always grow up in Chicago?" he asked during dessert, a seemingly innocent question that now carried additional weight. I knew he already knew the answer, but I answered anyway, carefully observing his reaction. Always, I confirmed. My family has been there for generations. I saw something shine in his eyes, a satisfaction that confirmed my growing suspicion. He wasn't discovering information about me, he was confirming information he already possessed. It's a beautiful, he commented, especially the neighborhood near Lincoln Park. My blood ran cold. He had specifically mentioned the area where I lived, where Isabel had clearly also lived. It wasn't general knowledge about Chicago, but specific, intimate knowledge, the kind that only someone who had been there personally would possess. Do you know Chicago well? I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral despite the whirlwind of emotions I felt. He paused, clearly realizing he had revealed more than he intended. I visited a few times, he said vaguely, but his eyes avoided mine. He was lying, or at least omitting significant parts of the truth. The question was, how far did his knowledge of me and my family go? And more disturbingly, what else did he know that I had not yet discovered? The rest of the dinner passed in silence. I feigned normalcy while I processed the disturbing implications of what I had discovered, and he seemed to sense that something had changed in my behavior, although he didn't know exactly what. When I retired to my quarters that night, I knew that everything had changed. I was no longer an innocent young woman who had been sold out of financial necessity to a stranger. I was a piece in a much more complex game, whose rules I didn't yet fully understand, but which clearly involved decades of obsession, loss, and a desperate search to recreate a past that could never be truly recovered. Lying in the luxurious bed, staring at the ornate ceiling, I began to formulate a plan. I needed to know more about Isabel, about what had really happened to her, about how far the connection between our pasts went, but mainly, I needed to discover what exactly my role was in this macabre story of lost love and impossible second chances. The following days became a careful game of discovery and decision. During the day, I played the role of the grateful young wife, exploring the gardens with Yasmin, learning the household routine, participating in the polite meals with my husband. But at night, when the palace slept, I became a detective, systematically exploring every corner in search of more clues about Isabel and about the true reasons for my presence. I discovered that the locked room was just the beginning. There were secret drawers in seemingly decorative furniture, hidden compartments behind paint, small hiding places scattered throughout the palace that held fragments of the story he was trying to keep alive. It was as if the entire structure of the palace was an elaborate memorial to a woman who had disappeared decades ago. On one of these nightly expeditions, I found something that completely changed my understanding of the situation. I was exploring a private office that was in a rarely used wing of the palace when I discovered a locked drawer in an antique desk. The lock was more sophisticated than the one on the room, but patience and some improvised tools finally opened it. Inside, there was a collection of time-yellowed letters, written in English with a handwriting I immediately recognized. It was the same as the annotations in the poetry. They were letters from Isabel to him, written during the period they were separated, documenting her desperate efforts to reconnect. The first letters were full of hope. My dear Omar, I know you will come back as soon as you can. New York is not the same without you, but I keep every moment we shared as treasures in my heart. She described her life in New York, the cafes they frequented together, the books she read thinking of, the places they used to walk that she now visited alone. But as the letters progressed chronologically, the tone changed. Hope gave way to anxiety, then to despair. It's been 2 years, Omar. People are starting to look at me with pity. My parents insist that I forget you, that I find someone more appropriate. But how can I forget someone I carry in every beat of my heart? The next letters revealed a progressive deterioration of Isabel's situation. The political situation in America had become difficult for people with connections to certain Middle Eastern countries. She mentioned being questioned by the police, having difficulty finding work, being ostracized by neighbors who viewed her with suspicion. Dear Omar, she wrote in a letter dated 1957, I'm afraid our correspondence is being monitored. Terrible things are happening to people like me, people who have connections with countries that are now seen as enemies. Maybe it's best if you don't answer this letter. Maybe it's best if we forget each other, at least until times get better. But the letters didn't stop there. There were more, written in an increasingly desperate handwriting. I need to leave New York. It's no longer safe for me here. I'm going to San Diego, where I have an aunt who can shelter me. If you get this letter, look for me there. But if too much time passes without news from me, I will try to move on, although I know that a part of me will always remain yours. The last letter in the collection was the most devastating. My love, if you are reading this, it means my previous letters have reached you. I hope you understand why I need to stop writing. The times are too dangerous, and my association with you is putting me at real risk. I will try to start my life over, although I know I will never be able to love anyone the way I love. Perhaps, in a future life, fate will allow us to be together. Until then, I hold you in my heart. Forever yours, Isabel. My hands trembled as I held the last letter. The date was 1959, over 60 years ago. Isabel had been forced to hide, to change her identity, to abandon her life because of the love she felt for Omar. And he, apparently, had never received these final letters, had never known what had really happened to her. But there was something else in the drawer, a modern envelope, clearly recent, with a U.S. postmark. My heart raced when I saw the return address, San Diego. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope and read the letter inside. It was from an American private investigator, reporting the results of a search that had lasted. Your Excellency, the formal letter said, after extensive investigation, we have confirmed that Isabelle Marie Dubois is alive and resides in San Diego under the name Marie Isabel Henderson. She never married, works as a retired librarian, and according to our informants, never completely got over the lost love of her. We have attached her current address as requested. My blood ran cold. Isabel was alive. He knew where she was. And yet, he had brought me here, had put me in her role, had turned me into a substitute for a woman who was still breathing somewhere in San Diego. I continued searching in the drawer and found more documents that painted an even more disturbing picture. There were detailed reports about my family, our financial situation, Mom's debts, even David's school record. The investigator had combed through our lives completely, documenting every aspect that could be used as leverage to force me to accept the deal. But the most shocking was a photographic report. Pages and pages of photographs of me, taken without my knowledge over months, walking to work, shopping at the market, leaving church on Sundays with Mom and David. There were even photographs through the window of our house, showing me reading at the kitchen table, helping David with his homework, comforting Mom during one of her crying spells. I had been studied, catalogued, evaluated as a product before I even knew I was being considered for anything. The resemblance to Isabel had not been a coincidence discovered by the intermediary. It had been the main criterion for my selection. I had been specifically chosen because I was a younger version of the woman he could never forget. The last document in the drawer was perhaps the most revealing of all. It was a contract, not the simple agreement I thought had been made, but a complex legal document that outlined not only the payment of my family's debts, but a series of other clauses I had never known existed. There were provisions for David's college education, a fund for Mom's medical care until the end of her life, even the purchase of a new house for them in a better neighborhood in Chicago. But there were also clauses that defined my own situation in a much more specific way than I had imagined. I wasn't just a bought wife. I was a contracted substitute with specific expectations about how I should, what interests I should develop, even how I should wear my hair to maximize my resemblance to Isabel. It was a document that reduced me to an actress hired to play a role in an elaborate fantasy of a man who couldn't accept that the past was lost. I put everything back in the drawer exactly as I had found it, but my mind was buzzing with the implications of what I had discovered. I was not an innocent victim of circumstances. I was an involuntary participant in a macabre play, an attempt to resurrect a love. In the days that followed my devastating discovery, Omar's behavior began to change in subtle but noticeable ways. It was as if he could feel that something had changed between us, although he didn't know exactly what. During dinners, he would watch me with a new intensity, as if he were looking for signs of something he had lost or hoped to find. "You seem different," he commented one night, as we walked on the terrace after the meal, "more distant. Did I do something to upset you?" There was a genuine vulnerability in his voice that contrasted with the calculated manipulation I now knew he had orchestrated to bring me there. "I'm just adapting," I lied, observing the stars that shone with an impossible intensity in the desert sky. It's very different from anything I've known. It wasn't exactly a lie. Discovering that my entire life had been manipulated by a man obsessed with a woman from the past was definitely different from anything I could have imagined. He stopped walking and turned to face me directly. In the moonlight, I could see the deep lines on his face, marks not only of age, but of decades carrying a pain that had shaped every important decision of his life. Madison, he said my name, with a softness that made me question if he really saw me as an individual person, or just as an updated version of his memories. There's something I need to tell you. My heart raced. Could it be that he was finally going to reveal the truth about Isabel? About why I was really there? What is it? I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. He walked to the balustrade and rested his hands on the coal. When I was young, I made a terrible mistake. I let go of the most important person in my life because I thought duty was more important than love. I spent decades regretting that decision, trying to find a way to correct what I had done wrong. His words echoed in the night air, like a confession that had been held back for decades. When I learned about your situation, about your family needing help, I saw an opportunity to maybe find a second chance. Not to replace what I lost, but to learn to love again, correctly this time. I turned to face him, surprised by the partial honesty of his words. He was admitting the connection to his past, although he still hadn't revealed the full extent of his manipulation, or the fact that he knew where Isabel was currently. What if I can't be that second chance? I asked softly. What if I'm just myself, not a version of someone you lost? For a long moment, he was silent, clearly struggling with the answer. Then, he said finally, maybe it's time for me to finally let the past rest. There was a resolve in his voice that hadn't been there before, as if our conversation was forcing him to confront truths he had avoided for decades. Omar. I said his name for the first time, and I saw that he reacted as if he had been physically hit. If you had the chance to correct the mistake of the past, would you take it? Even if it meant losing what you have now? He looked at me with an intensity that seemed to pierce my very soul. What exactly are you asking, Madison? It was my chance. I could continue feigning ignorance, playing the role of the naive young wife, or I could force the truth to emerge. I'm asking about Isabel, I said, carefully watching his reaction. I'm asking if you still love her, if you still think about her, if I'm here because I look like her. The color drained from his face as if I had cast a spell. His hands gripped the balustrade so tightly that his knuckles turned white. How did you? He started, but couldn't finish the sentence. I found the room, I confessed. I found the photographs, the letters, everything. I know about New York, about the two of you, about what happened when you had to leave. I didn't mention that I also knew she was still alive in San Diego. I would save that revelation for the right moment. He moved away from the balustrade as if he needed space to process the fact that his secrets had been discovered. Madison, he tried to explain, but I interrupted him. No, I said firmly. It's my turn to talk. I know you brought me here because I look like her. I know our family was investigated, that our financial situation was documented, that I was watched for months before being discovered by the intermediary. It wasn't a coincidence. It was careful planning. The confession came out like an avalanche. Years of being passive and accepting what others decided for me, finally giving way to a courage I didn't know I possessed. The question is, what do we do now? Do we continue pretending this is a real marriage? Or do you finally admit that this is an elaborate play to heal a wound that never healed? Omar was silent for so long that I thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with a brutal honesty that made him seem decades older. You're right about everything, he admitted. Every word you said is. I brought you here because you reminded me of her, because I thought maybe I could recreate something I lost a long time ago. He turned to face me again, and I saw tears in his eyes. The first genuine, uncalculated emotions I had witnessed since my arrival. But what I've discovered is that you're not her. You're someone completely different, with your own strength, your own wisdom, your own beauty that has nothing to do with superficial resemblance. And I realize now that trying to turn you into someone else was cruel to both you and me. His words surprised me. I had expected denial, anger, maybe attempts to justify his actions. I had not expected this complete admission, and what seemed to be a genuine recognition of his mistakes. "So what do we do now?" I asked, echoing my previous question. "How do we correct this?" Omar walked to one of the chairs on the terrace and sat down heavily, as if the weight of decades of deception was finally taking it. "There's something else you need to know," he said, and my heart braced for another revelation. "Isabel didn't die. She's alive, living in San Diego. I know where she is." I feigned surprise, although I already knew this information. "How do you know?" "I hired investigators. They found her a few months ago. She never married, never completely got over what happened between us. But when I learned this, instead of going to her, instead of trying to correct the original mistake, I brought you. I used you as a substitute because I was afraid she would reject me, that it was too late for us." The honesty was devastating in its complete. He had known the location of the woman he loved and, instead of going after her, he had created a substitute through me. It was simultaneously tragic and unforgivable. "You need to go to her," I said, the words coming out before I could question if it was wise to say them. "You need to try to correct the original mistake, not create new mistakes." "And you?" he asked, his dark eyes meeting mine across the distance. "What happens to you if I do that?" "Your family still needs the financial help. You're still here, far from home, because of my It was a complex question that went to the heart of the entire moral dilemma of the situation. "My family will be fine," I said, hoping it was. "What matters now is doing the right thing. And the right thing is for you to go after Isabel. Admit your mistakes. See if there's still a chance for the two of you. Even if it means you'll be alone here. Even if it means that what we did was fundamentally wrong. Especially because of that," I replied. "Because continuing to pretend won't make it any less wrong. It will only create more harm for more people." Omar stood up and walked to where I was. For a moment, I thought he would try to convince me to stay, that he would argue we could build something real despite the false foundation. Instead, he took my hands gently in his. "You are an extraordinary woman, Madison," he said. "Much stronger and wiser than I deserved to find. If the circumstances were different, if I were a different man, ... double quotes his voice trailed off, leaving the sentence incomplete. "But you're not a different man," I completed gently. "You are a man who loved deeply and lost everything, and you deserve the chance to try to recover what was lost. And I am a woman who deserves to be loved for who I truly am, not for who I resemble." We stood there on the terrace under the stars, to strangers that fate had intertwined in a complex and problematic way, finally seeing each other clearly for the first time. It was simultaneously an end and a beginning, the end of the illusion that had brought us together, and the beginning of a mutual understanding of what it meant to truly love. "I will travel to San Diego," he said finally. "I will find Isabel and try to explain everything that happened. Ask for her forgiveness. See if there is still any possibility for us. And you." "I will go back to Chicago," I said, completing the thought he hesitated to verbalize. "I will go back home, to my family, to my own life." But even as I said those words, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. I had changed during my time there. I had discovered a strength in me that I didn't know existed. I had learned that I deserved more than to passively accept what others decided. Going back to Chicago would be a physical return, but emotionally, I was a different person. "Madison," Omar said, still holding my hand, "can I make one final confession?" I nodded, prepared for any additional revelation. "In the last few days, watching you discover the truth, seeing your courage in confronting impossible situations, I started to fall in love with you. Not for your resemblance to Isabel, but for who you truly are. And that made me realize that what I felt for Isabel decades ago was real. But what I could feel for you would also be real, only different." His words touched me deeply, but they also confirmed that making the right decision was even more important. "That's why you need to go after her," I said softly, "to discover if what you had still exists, or if it's just a beautiful memory that should be honored but not recreated, and to give me the chance to discover who I am when I'm not playing the role of someone else." The next morning, Omar left for San Diego. It wasn't a dramatic farewell or full of impossible promises. It was the respectful separation of two people who cared about each other but understood that their lives were destined to follow different paths. I stayed at the palace for a few more days, packing my few belongings and processing everything that had happened. Yasmin, with her silent wisdom, seemed to understand that significant changes were occurring. She helped me with a kindness that transcended linguistic barriers, as if she recognized a companion on difficult journeys. Before I left, I visited the secret room where I had discovered the truth about Isabel one last time. I looked at the photographs, reread some of the letters, tried to imagine what it would be like to finally find the man she had loved and lost so many decades ago. Would it be a happy reunion? Or would they discover that some wounds were too deep to heal, that some losses were too permanent to be reversed? 3 weeks later, I received a letter in Chicago. It was from Omar, written in the elegant handwriting I had learned to recognize. The letter was brief, but full of meaning. Dear Madison, I found Isabel. She forgave me, and we are trying to rebuild what was lost so long ago. It's different from what it was when we were young. We are different people now, shaped by decades of separate life. But there is something there, a foundation on which we can perhaps build something new. I hope you also find your own happiness, your own love story that is completely yours. You deserve nothing less than that. With eternal gratitude and genuine affection, Omar. I folded the letter carefully and put it in the drawer where I kept the few mementos I had brought from my strange adventure. Part of me was happy for them, happy that two people who had suffered so much finally had the chance to heal old wounds.
If this story kept you hooked until now, just imagine the next ones. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any. Give this one a like, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from right now.
But another part of me wondered if I would be able to find my own love story, my own version of happiness that wasn't anyone else's shadow. David, now enrolled in a better school thanks to the resources the deal had provided, found me reading the letter in the kitchen of our new house, smaller than the palace, obviously, but infinitely warmer and full of real love. Who's the letter from, Madi? He asked, using the affectionate childhood nickname. From someone who taught me that sometimes love means letting go, I replied, running my hand through his messy hair. And that sometimes the greatest act of courage is to allow people to follow their own paths, even when it means going alone for a while. He looked at me with the peculiar seriousness of children who grow up too fast. Are you sad to be back home? I considered the question carefully. Was I sad? Was I regretful? Or was I, perhaps for the first time in my life, exactly where I was supposed to be? No, I said finally, and I realized it was completely. I'm exactly where I need to be. And for the first time, I'm here because I chose to be, not because someone decided for me. Mom appeared at the kitchen door, carrying fresh flowers from the small garden we had planted together. She looked at me with the expression I knew well, part pride, part concern, completely love. My brave girl, she said simply, as if she knew exactly what experiences I had been through, although I had never told her the full story. And there, in our new kitchen in Chicago, with David doing homework at the table, and Mom arranging flowers in a simple vase, I understood something fundamental about love. It wasn't about finding someone who completed us, or about becoming the version of another person that someone had lost. It was about choosing, every day, to love and be loved for who we really were. My story with Omar was over, but my own story was just beginning. And this time, I would be both the author and the protagonist, writing each chapter with my own hands, creating an ending that would be completely mine. Sometimes, at night, I still thought about the Golden Palace, the impossibly bright stars of the desert, the library full of books that whispered stories of love lost and found. But they were memories that belonged to the past, lessons learned in a distant land that now informed the present without controlling it. And when I finally found my own love, and somehow I knew I would, it would be a completely new story, written by two people who chose each other, not for resemblance to the past, but for the promise of the future. It would be real, it would be mine, and it would be enough.